Now, we have the Hills here, and I put out a poll about 15 minutes ago asking, is Hank Hill based? And it's sitting at about 60% yes, 40% no in the chat. So, what do you guys think?
Jay can go first.
Maybe we'll assert that at the end once we get through all of it.
I actually think so. I'm going to go with yes on this, and I'll preempt I think that a lot of the no's are basically like, oh, like he's propositional nation, like America, kind of like
the grill pill, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that puts Hank Hill from 1997 and places him in the world of 2023. Like this is fundamentally like part of what's so attractive about it is it really is about a different world. It is pre-Obama America. And that was a really different world. Like I remember it well. I kind of grew up in it. And so like to me, the people like Hank Hill that I know are that I would say they kind of fall into the type of people who shouldn't have to be political, kind of like the normal everyday Joes who really don't have anything to do with politics, who work kind of like real jobs. And I think that it's like this weird mental illness to demand that everything you like and every person you like essentially like regurgitate your like esoteric right. And I'm not saying you guys, but you're like esoteric right politics. And so to me, like, and maybe this is me getting a little over emotional about it because I know like half a dozen guys who aren't just Hank Hill, which is part of the reason I love this show so much. But to me, those are the kind of like good people who should be like in an ideal world thriving and unconcerned with politics. And I think that this show kind of shows a window into a time when they could still do that.
And nowadays, Hank Hill would have to have a position on, Gamergate and January 6th, as we talked about earlier, and that just wouldn't work.
He would be listening to Rush Limbaugh and posting Facebook memes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm just gonna give my take really quickly. I think you did a very nice job covering a lot of my sentiments, Jay. But I mean, the reason this character is controversial in the DR, and he is controversial in the DR. I mean, I know that Academic Agents had requests for covering King of the Hill, and he's basically refused on account of like Hank Hill being a boomer truther, right? I remember at the Skildings event, Walrus, where we were talking about to the people who were there, and I talked to some of them who were there last year, and how there had been a speech talking about how like Hank Hill is the model, citizen for us to emulate, and that had turned into like this big shouting match and controversy. I wish I was there last year for that. It would have been it would have been great just to be a fly on the wall to see it. And of course I've taken a few notes here just to list kind of, okay, what are the points, like when people talk about Hank Hill being a boomer truther, what are the points kind of against Hank Hill? And it's really about like him having drunk the Kool-Aid on the kind of civil rights, progressive civil rights values, right? We talk about the Martin Luther King type. It's not about the color of her skin, but the content of her character. And he repeats that line in the show many times. There's an episode in the show where he's sort of concerned that like his dog has become racist because of him, right? Because he has like a black repairman in to check his hot water tank. And like his dog attacks the repairman, and because he's black, then there's like this big drama that comes out of that, where everybody thinks that Hank is racist, and he has to like bend over backwards to prove that he doesn't care about race, he's colorblind, and he's eventually able to prove that, right? So he sort of he keeps just kind of harking back to these truths, even though I think he's you'd think that he's old enough to remember schools being desegregated like when he was alive, but of course Hank's age is disputed because he was like, according to the executives, he's actually supposed to be 32 years old in the show, but that's only something they did on account of that being like the perfect viewer age for the Fox News viewers at the sort of the Fox viewers at the time. But I mean, in reality, this guy can't be 32. Like he has to be like at least like 40 plus, like early 50 something. And of course, that's the kind of points against, okay, why is Hank not based? Because he keeps kind of clinging on to this center right, boomer con colorblindness. But I will put like the point in his favor why he is based, because the writers on King of the Hill, they were basically instructed to read a book by Philip K. Howard. That's like this lawyer type that's called The Death of Common Sense. And they were just basically told by Mike Judge that like The Death of Common Sense is the book that's going to kind of like define the spirit of the project of Hank Hill in the show. And what that book is about is really, not in the language that we use, but if you apply the language of, say, James Burnham to the content of that book, it's really about like how the United States is becoming gradually more managerialized through the legal system, and how like everything has to be processed through some court, even if it's something as stupid as like two mothers disagreeing about what kids should be on the swing, right? It's like everybody has to be litigious, everything has to go to the court, and everybody's suing everybody else. And they think that the courts are like some kind of supercomputer, perfect software program that's just going to solve all of their problems, where it's not actually possible to make sovereign decisions as an individual, or to use common sense to solve problems. Where he's, the author is sort of advocating for like, we need to sort of try to break down some of these laws and start going back to just having the individual make the decisions for themselves. Which that is something that is inherently based, but it doesn't stop there, because, okay, this book was released, I think, in the 90s, but this author has continued to sort of release things up until 2001, where he released a paper, like this legal paper that's it's called Progressivism Leads to Paralysis, or something like that, where he just argues that all of these problems that he talks about, the kind of over litigiousness about Americans, it comes from like this sort of progressive worldview and the progressive politics going back to FDR. So in my view, that means that like the arc of Hank Hill, if he's alive to 2001, is basically to this kind of Christopher Caldwell Age of Entitlement, like actually understanding that progressivism is actually bad, and taking more of this kind of nuanced dissident perspective. And I don't know what you think of that, but like that's my argument for why I think like Hank Hill is actually kind of based.
I think you're at least very, very spot on in the sort of analysis of the character, and I think some of the, the dynamic that makes the show good comes largely from Hank being, in like 90% of the situations, he's the straight man, and he's also the main character, which is unusual for these types of shows. And I was going to say it, but Nordhuger in the chat basically beat me to it. He says, he's a good-hearted medieval peasant who's been thrust into techno-modernity and is over his head, but he's trying his best. And I think that flows well with your idea of common sense, Ludwig, that we live in a society today that requires a lot more from people who do not have either the want or the faculties to care about it or make those decisions. And, we made it everyone's business.
Exactly. And like you said, Hank he's more of like this kind of working peasant type, where he doesn't have the big picture thinking that's required to think about like geopolitics or any larger ideas regarding it. All he can do is try to keep the barbarians at bay, like try to keep order. And that is like most of the episodes in King of the Hill. It's some type of conflict where Hank has to try to maintain order against the kind of progressive pause that just keeps floating to the surface. I mean, just as an example, there's Hank Hill works at Strickland Propane, and there's an episode where he has to hire a new employee because they lack manpower. And Hank doesn't, he gets several applicants, and he gets a qualified female applicant that he doesn't want to hire because she's too attractive. And he's sort of afraid that he's gonna cheat on his wife, or he's gonna be tempted because they would develop some type of office romance. So he chooses to hire the male applicant instead. But of course, the applicant is a drug addict, right? He's like this completely useless, addicted guy who just makes a mess of things in the office. And then so he has to turn around and try to fire the guy, and that would be the common sense approach. Okay, we hired this guy by a mistake. He doesn't belong here. He can't do a good job, so we have to fire him. But then, like one of these, bureaucrats, that's Anthony Page, the kind of redhead, glasses, social worker guy comes in and says that, well, I mean, if the company has more than 10 employees, then you're subject to a different type of laws, and you have to do this and this, and you can't actually fire the guy because there's all these civil rights that are protecting him and so on. So they have to hold on to this kind of like drug addict employee that can't do anything because of the laws. And that's where you get the perspective, like the common sense against the kind of encroaching managerial law structure that he's always fighting against in this show.
Well, I think that one of the other things that we kind of talk about in these circles is essentially that there are things that you kind of need to have on a cultural level that aren't rational, that are kind of pre-rational, and you don't really want to or need to get into the weeds of kind of defining them. And specifically,
I'll quote the rug merchant here and say that civilization is indescribable.
Well, yeah, I agree. And one of the things that is a constant running joke, because admittedly it is a funny thing, and I know people like this. There's a kind of a trend of middle Americans who are so prudish that they essentially cannot even say like anatomical terms. There's an early episode where Peggy Hill has to teach a class,
like fool herself into saying
right. And you see this thing continually with Hank Hill and Luann, where he's like so focused on being proper that he gets mad at her for dressing immodestly around the house or putting their laundry in the same hamper, which is on one hand like kind of silly, right? And it's played as a joke, but that kind of like deep.
One of the greatest early jokes is I think it's when he has to go after his mother for something. Like his mother has like ran off with like an RV or something, and Bobby wants to come along, but then he like taps him on the shoulder, like holds him on the shoulder and says, "No, son, tomorrow is garbage day." And then Bobby gets this like duty look in his eyes and does almost like he's like seconds away from giving him like a salute, because he understands that I have to take out the trash, I have to be the man of the house when you're gone. And it's this sort of approach to your surroundings that is required to build a society, right?
Well, and I think that that's a big like part of the comedy is that essentially even in the 90s, the 2000s, Hank Hill is kind of a man outside of time. Like he is not necessarily a good fit for society, which is why his prudishness is a joke, because it's funny. It's like he doesn't really match the rest of society. But I think that is an admirable trait if we consider ourselves like traditionalists or reactionaries in any sense.
Yes, because his prudishness cannot be explained by some kind of inherited tradition. Like you have the picture there where he has like, his father Cotton Hill and his mother, and like his mother is this sort of traveling like globe-trotting hippie, and his father is kind of a degenerate in his own way. Like he's very, I guess old school in this kind of masculine sense, but he's not prudish, or he's not a proper person in the same way Hank is. So he is, like you said, a man out of time, and this also makes him like one of the best straight men ever, like in a comedy where he's like the straight man and the clown is like the entire United States. Basically, that's how I feel about this show. And like, I mean, not only because he is a straight man, but kind of what Hank's position is. Like when you go into this situation, he doesn't have to say like, okay, this is how I feel about nudity, and this is how I feel about swear words, this is how I feel about burning the flag, or feel about like gender bending and stuff. You always know where you have Hank. There's no surprises with him, and you're also kind of allowed to laugh at him because he is the kind of white man character. So you couldn't have done this the other way, where you have like some kind of like shit-lib character who has progressive beliefs, and you kind of first of all, you don't know what their beliefs are because they change constantly, and second of all, like there's certain things you just can't laugh at. And
that was literally tried in the show that killed this one, Cleveland Brown, or what he's called, the Family Guy people who made like a spin-off, and that didn't last long. So
yeah, that might be true. I'd never watched Cleveland.
I haven't watched all of it. I've just watched like 2 episodes, and then I figured, no, this is boring.
But yeah, the straight man and the comedy from the straight man, it has to almost come from this conservative perspective. It cannot be liberal. It cannot be leftist in any way. Like leftist humor you could get from some, say, Transgression, for instance, and it would be transgressing against people like Hank Hill in positions of power. Like say someone like Seth Rogen, where it's like the only joke that he has is like, dude, weed Lamau, you know. But if weed is institutionalized and it's sold to you at all of these dispensaries, and it's just kind of a normal part of life, like buying painkillers, there's nothing transgressive about it. So I think, that was just my point, that this guy's just such a great comedic character as well, because of his disposition.
There's a famous clip from it, actually. This dovetails both with kind of the weed conversation, and like one of the other things that I like about this show is it is fundamentally, like anti-government and anti-bureaucracy. Is this this interaction where Hank Hill has found some type of like Indian artifact, and so has gone to a thinly veiled University of Austin to go talk with a local expert, and he's confronted on campus by a guy with a list of signatures asking Hank Hill to sign to decriminalize hemp. And he sells it to Hank Hill by saying like, oh, like it's government overreach. They're trying to prevent us from making good rope. And Hank is like, oh, well, of course, like I want the government out of my life. And then after he signs it, of course, the pothead reveals like, oh, and you can smoke it like marijuana. And, he's horrified by this. And so like, obviously there's a joke in that, like it's comedy, but that does speak to kind of another thing that is very like kind of inherently conservative about the show, that it is both, has a relatively negative view of, weed, which was, at the time kind of on the, very much kind of like you said about Rogan, like being like injected into the culture, but also is very much kind of anti-bureaucracy in a very kind of like honest and I think fundamentally American way.
All up until the later seasons as well. I remember there's one episode with this like diversity guy coming into Bobby's school and sort of like grifting himself into, oh, you need to do a diversity check on your school, right? Even though the school has like literally no metric problems that they can really be held accountable for. Everything looks fine, but like, oh, what's your diversity rate? It's 42. That's good, but that means it's they're going to start killing each other. Or something. And he's like, look at that group of diverse kids. It's just a powder keg waiting to blow. And it ends with, of course, Hank telling Bobby that you can't be an SJW, because that's basically what he turns into. You have to find a middle ground, I guess, is what he advocates for. You have to like focus on just being a good guy and get your work done, really.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great, and it's another example of this kind of like legal absurdism, or this this government, like the war on racism and the war on this and the war on that comes in, and they just find problems where none exists. They keep ramping up more of this legalist stuff. I mean, it's another reason that I like this show, is that it actually you can learn a lot about the United States watching it, because the stuff that's happening, it's not just stuff that they made up for the episodes. It usually reflects something that's been in the papers or stuff that's happened. So that if say you have an episode from like 2001 and there's something about, I don't remember if it was 2001, but there's one episode I think about soda machines being put into elementary schools, making the kids fat. And like I looked it up, and that this is something that actually happened, right? This is I mean, you could probably back me up on this, Jay Burden. Like,
yeah, it's funny. I actually remember that very distinctly, because that was when I would have been in elementary school, and I very much remember that it was. And this actually, a lot of this happened under first term Obama, because one of the big things that Michelle did was, I can't remember the name of it, but it was everywhere. When I was right at the target age, was trying to essentially like make kids healthy, and so it was a big push.
We had Jamie Oliver over here being the front face for that. It was pretty much the same thing.
Another prominent male figure, but yes. Sorry, the Michelle Obama is a man memes are like deeply.
They're great. But I love them.
Yeah, so I remember that. That's odd that you bring that up, because I hadn't seen that episode, but that was something I experienced, firsthand.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, yeah, I just love that stuff. That you can just learn so much in terms of what's actually going on there. because it really lends an element of groundedness to the show that you don't have in other shows, where it's all in the author's head, and it's all about like the author's feelings, and whatever happens has to be dictated by this sort of narrative. Where here it's like there is sort of a world that exists that they're reacting to, and that creates a lot of the great the great comedy and like the great conflicts in the show. But we've talked a lot about Hank Hill. That I think we're gonna have to comment a little bit on his family as well.
Yeah.
So which one do we want to do? Like Peggy, Bobby, Cotton.
Let's do Bobby first, because I think he has the most sort of interaction. I mean, opposition to Hank, in that he, it's that boy in right line that he says. In that he's very much not like his father. He's a lot more, well, I guess effeminate is the word to use.
He's extremely kind of a quirky kid. So I have a quote here from Mike Judge. He says, quote, "I was trying to capture the kind of kid who is capable of sitting on the couch expressionless for hours and hours," end quote. And quote, "the kind of kid who sits and wears a t-shirt at a public swimming pool." Right. So he is just supposed to reflect another kind of American archetype of kids, even though he's sort of it's very much about like the difficulties of having a kid who doesn't live up to the expectations, where like you have both the Peggy and Hank, who are quite in their own ways very athletic, outgoing people, and Bobby, who's only interested in like sitting inside watching television, eating food.
How did you get an F in English, Bobby? You speak English. Yeah, that's one of the great quotes I remember. Sorry.
But it's also, revealed like in the show that Bobby has a lot of hidden talents, right? And they don't really know, like from the more kind of square perspective of Hank Hill, he doesn't really know how to capitalize, or what do you do if you're like your son is it's like this kind of chubby boy who's like a very good dancer, or like very good at like playing chess or doing quizzes or something. It's so it's like this mismatch of expectations between father and son. I guess the only like possible point they could have had a reconciliation is like.
Hang on a moment. Sorry. Ashurvad Gutam in chat is saying, "Is this a gaming channel?"
Yes, it is.
And the game, yes, it is. And the game is to figure out what our political position is.
Okay, that's sorry. Perfect.
Go back.
Yeah, well, all right. Yeah, we got Walrus Gaming tonight. So
there are rumors of Walrus Gaming happening at certain late hours. If you're a keen-eyed viewer, you might have spotted
in the midnight hour. In the midnight hour when the moon shines high, and there's with the little glimpse in your eye, you look around the corner and there you find the Walrus Gaming. I mean, one of the funnier episodes I think with Bobby is the episode where they figure out that Bobby is kind of a crack shot, and this is something that you'd think that they could bond over, right? Shooting guns, which is sort of very quintessentially American thing, and not just American, but also a Texan thing. But I mean, the comedy there is that actually Hank is scared of guns, which is which makes it even worse, right? So
I guess it's more that Hank respects guns more than Bobby does.
Yeah, but
feels like.
I think in the episode they show that he's not very good at shooting. So he has to pay like this kind of hypnotist guy to help him with sports performance.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just kind of it's kind of left there, but you do see that there are plenty of opportunities where they could potentially bond, but they like this tension or like this conflict where they just can't find anything to agree on, and they just keep living in these separate universes while at the same time trying to meet each other. It's it creates a lot of good comedy. I don't know, Jay, do you have any thoughts on Bobby?
So I actually, and this will be a common refrain, I growing up knew several kids who were essentially Bobby Hill. Like, it's a very common, I guess, like type of kid. And even to the point that my roommate's younger brother is kind of a similar archetype. And his dad, being of the kind of like Hank Hill demographic, that pairing is a pretty common one. And Whereas in the early 90s, I think it was, Bobby Hill was definitely like Judge described, like sitting on the couch watching television. I think you see it now kind of on the internet, so people my age who are kind of like raised by the algorithm can have a very difficult time relating to kind of their older Gen X, younger baby boomer parents who are, people like Hank Hill, like very analog kind of real world people. And so you see that breakdown quite commonly. And I think especially when it's across a kind of, like, and I don't mean to say class in the sense of like how much they're paid, but class in the sense of education divide. So for a lot of people, like as college degrees have gotten more common, whereas their parents might have been high school graduates or trade school graduates and worked kind of blue collar jobs, like selling propane or, farming, things like that. Their children, even as adults, if they went to school or have more kind of like digital careers, you see that same breakdown. And so it really is describing a pretty big disconnect in kind of like rural and suburban America. And there are a lot of people, even if they're not like literal Bobby Hills, in the sense of like a pathetic, like, kind of comedic fat child, they were that kid in 1997, and so it really, again, is describing something very real.
I was going to say Bobby, would be, well, not me, but me in the sense that Bobby would grow up to watch cooking videos on YouTube, to learn how to do things, while Hank sort of just, he tried desperately to get him to only grill. Not that I don't grill, but it's one of those things where, you get the millennials these days are more intellectual and unable to apply that common sense to real life situations that sort of is ingrained in Hank, and that's sort of what Bobby lacks.
Yeah, that's actually very well put. So yeah, it's a nice description of like the divide between like the kid and the parent. Even though with Bobby, they don't get the internet until a little bit later in the seasons, but I guess it's the television then and the magazines.
I mean, he's frequently punished for stuff he does by like being told to go watch TV or something. Yeah.
But then like the other question is like the Bobby, I guess not the physiognomy, but the physique. Why is he so fat? Is it because of like the corn syrup and the processed food, or is it because like there's some habit of trying to bribe children with sweets and so on? What do you think, Jay?
I mean, it's hard to say. At least in my experience, I never really saw like food being used as like a bribe by parents. It probably happened. I just never saw it. But what you saw happen is that, and one of my favorite authors is an American by the name of Wendell Berry. He has written a lot of fiction and a lot of kind of philosophy as well. Most famous for a short essay, "Why I Will Never Own a Computer," which is worth your time. It's like 3 pages. But he describes in some of his fiction, which kind of describes kind of like rural America. What he talks about is that there were kind of like patterns in rural America that were like kind of developed to fit a different time and place. So specifically, right, like during the Depression, a lot of rural Americans are hungry often. And so they kind of developed this relationship to food where you ate as much as you could get. So I see this in my grandpa, right? He's an older guy. He was raised by children of the Depression. And then this attitude that like, no matter what, you clean your plate, you don't leave anything to waste. And when kind of food quality in America was higher and food was more expensive, like you could kind of get away with having a certain relationship to food, but as the food in America has gotten so cheap and so unhealthy that a lot of people who essentially used to just eat until they were full, but it was real food. And so fair enough. Like maybe if you looked at working class guys in the 70s, they might've had a little bit of a beer gut, they might've been a little bit overweight. But that relationship to food, where now food is like an active choice where you have to say like enough is enough. Like a lot of those people just never had to act that way towards food. And so that's where I think you see a lot of the like massive obesity in rural America. And I'm not going to say that's what Bobby represents, but there a lot of the
it gets to the point where it's that what's it called, like you have third world and then you have second world, like you see South America where the bad food is cheap. So if you're poor, you're overweight, basically.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think that there's this kind of like idea that, you know, the bribe paid to the American middle class and American working class was essentially, it was cheapness and quantity. You know, so like, oh, you can now buy, you know, what would have been luxuries when you were a kid. You can buy like a cheap knockoff version of that for a tenth of what it used to cost. And so whereas, and I know, I mean, I know a lot of people like this. They're the kind of like tradition of frugality, you know, that was like, oh, you're always hunting for a deal. That made a lot of sense when there was a lot more material privation. Now that leads you down the line of essentially, and this is what like one of the other great like things in, you know, King of the Hill is Megalomart, right? That leads you to these like big box stores where you can buy essentially like mass produced, you know, Chinese crap and full of, you know, essentially like corn syrup. And it's this case where it's much like the rest of, you know, King of the Hill. It's like people who are kind of out of time, and their instincts are no longer kind of like well suited to their environment.
I mentioned cooking videos, and there's this guy called Cooking with Jack, who's like the source for a lot of ridicule online. But he's genuinely the guy who will make food based on like, oh yeah, I found like this 5-pound bag of American like pre-shredded cheese, right? Which is the most disgusting thing I ever seen. And you know, he's gonna make food based on that, and everything he makes to someone who's used to higher quality ingredients is just absolutely disgusting. But then considering that, you know, to quote unquote most Americans, that's what they can afford, that's what they get, right?
Well, and you see it, and I see someone in the chat saying this, that because I was fat in high school, and I ended up, actually, this is one of the other reasons I have a attachment to Peterson. It's essentially like I got started on Jordan Peterson and lost like 65 pounds over the course of the summer. And I got like
That's
super
great.
motivated.
Congrats.
And oh yeah, thank you. And it like changed my life. But a big part of the reason that I got fat was never that I was like, you know, a binge eater or like super into, you know, like food culture even. It's just the default portions in America and the default relationship to food will make you fat no matter what. You know, and so
Vingle had a comment there. Can you bring that up, Walrus?
The meal portion?
Yes.
Well, the meal portion thing, I remember from when I visited the US, my dad and I asked our servers at some point, just because we were curious. Like we did this multiple places because the portions are so huge at restaurants. Like, are we? Do you expect us to eat all this? Basically, was the question. And the servers usually said no. It's like an expectation that you get a doggy bag, but this might be certain types of restaurants, right?
That's true, and that kind of varies. And then again, a lot of it is just that, like, and this is a big class distinction now. Essentially, like in the U.S., like one of the stereotypes you hear from Euros about Americans is that essentially all Americans exist on the extremes. You know, like Americans are either super fit or super fat, and there's very few people.
Everything is bigger in America, is what we say.
Right? Yeah, there's a huge gap, and that's partially true, but a big part of that is class. You know, and so in kind of like my social class, which is kind of like the lower rungs of the laptop class, like the PMC, there are still people who are overweight, but it is a very strong social stigma. And so like in any other time, like your class is like a big signifier is diet. And so it's weird because in kind of like higher end universities, like, you know, universities that I either went to or lived near, like even the parents, like no one is overweight. But then you go to kind of like the Walmart down the street, the IRL Megalomart, and the only person who doesn't, you know, have a BMI of 30 plus is 15, you know? And so it is odd. And the kind of like, and I think that's one of the other reasons that, like, I mean, you look at Hank Hill and Hank Hill is overweight, you know, Boomhauer's, every one of them's got a gut. And that is very kind of like, that is true to people like them in the real world.
But it is that sort of old school gut, though, isn't it? It's not the hyper obese.
Yeah, it's the beer gut, which is
that is
the, like what I was saying, like that's the kind of like working, the working man of
The
kind of
working
like
class guy. Yeah.
and he has a little bit too much, he has a little bit too much, beer on the weekends, and he's not super active.
He's
And
not
that
super
is,
active on the weekends. Maybe he works a job that sort of offsets the worst of it, right? Like he has a physical job, but he doesn't work out, so it ends up sort of it all
yeah. And
falls
I
to
think
the gut. Yeah.
one of the other things that you've also seen in this is that part of the other reason I have a lot of, I guess, like affection for this show is that it really is a different time also, in the sense that like obesity is always, like, ever since I've been alive, been a massive problem in the US, but it is getting worse and worse over time. And the kind of like a lot of rural America that you see in this, it isn't like rural, like they're all on farms, but it is a, a more like rural show. It is, the people who live there are becoming kind of like more and more like debased and depressed. And so even though there are things in this show like, like times are like money is, in certain sense scarce, like there's not, there are people who are, have, you see a lot actually in this, the start of kind of like the drug problems in rural America. Like there's a lot of episodes about like crack or things like that. But those trends have only continued. And so even though the world of King of the Hill is not necessarily idyllic, by comparison to what you currently see in places like where I live, which was where the, a lot of the, like the opioid crisis and now like the meth crisis have been really like, kind of like ravaging the communities. It seems idyllic by comparison.
No, I believe it. I absolutely believe it. I mean, just tracing back, another thing that I've noticed, like with American portion sizes, is also that they have free refills on soda, which I assume is another kind of contributor. Like we talked about the soda machines in schools and so on. I mean, yeah, it's almost easier to drink yourself fat than to eat yourself fat, in my experience.
Oh, definitely. And that's
But
another. Oh, sorry.
yeah, but like with the obesity stuff, like I had the impression that obesity was the problem in the United States, and it kind of peaked around like 2010 something, and it's been going down. But you're saying that it's continuing to go up in certain areas.
I would say so. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I have hard data on this. I just kind of have, people I've seen, and I know that a lot of like, especially like rural working Americans are getting just fatter and fatter, and COVID made it exceptionally worse. Because obviously a lot of those guys kept, working and kept on their feet. But really what you see a lot is that people are still working hard jobs and they're overweight, and it's just destroying their bodies, because they're just putting a ton of strain on it. So people like my grandfather's a great example, and he stayed, and I kind of feel sympathy for him because he stayed thin while he was smoking. And then when he quit smoking, he started eating to kind of cope with it, which I think is a pretty common thing. And now he's obese. And, even though he's retired, obviously, he's relatively young. He's in his late 60s, but his body's just broken down through a combination.
Yeah. How much is there left, really? Right.
I mean, nothing. Like all of his joints are gone. His heart is in terrible shape. And admittedly, a part of that,
you just sort of become like you work all life, you eat like shit because that's all you have access to, and then you sort of just become a liability on the healthcare system, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the other things is that a lot of this show is, and I don't mean to just continually like narcissistically talk about my personal experience in America, but one of the
that's
things
why we have you here.
Yeah, that's why you're here.
One of the things that I do like about this show is that it kind of speaks back to a culture when taking from the government was viewed with a lot of suspicion, and it was a very like low social status activity, like, and you still see that in a lot of rural America, but less and less over time. And it's kind of shifted, and you've seen this shift, and part of it's just game theory, right? Like if the other person is just like smash and grab, like I'm going to get mine, if you don't also assume the same attitude, you're going to lose out. But I think you've seen a shift from kind of viewing government handouts as a kind of like low class or like undesirable to take, and you saw a bunch of this rhetoric during the Obama years, like, oh, I don't want to be on welfare. Like being on welfare is like this super shameful, like embarrassing thing. And then whereas, now it's much more like, well, I'm going to get mine. And, and some of that came
that is
through.
very interesting, because that is something that's in my experience still alive here in Norway, right, Ludwig? I mean,
I'm
it
going
is
to get
still
mine
there's
stuff, or
still a
that it's
lot of
shame associated
Yeah.
with government handouts.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
yeah, I
my
mean, if
dad even
it's
used it when I turned like 16 or something, or 17 or something. He basically told me, like, you're going to have to get a job, or because you have to pay me rent if you're going to keep living here, if you're not going to study right now, right?
yeah, I think it's
So
a
you got
good
to get
kind
a
of
job, or you're going to go get welfare. And I'm not going to have a son that gets welfare, so go get a job.
yeah, no, there
Was
is still a
basically
sort
the
of
message that I got, right?
a stigma around that, and I think in a healthy society there should be a stigma around that. Like repeating what we've said previously in the stream, like in a healthy society, people like Hank Hill should thrive. You shouldn't be punished for being Hank Hill, right? This is like should be like the dominant strategy for how people survive and thrive in society. But yeah, now it's basically, things are just getting worse. And I mean, with the electricity prices and the interest rate increases and inflation and so on, I think people are being more kind of, okay, I'm just going to take whatever I can get, right? I've taken that attitude as well. It's like, okay, if you can get some money from the government, you just take it, because they're the ones who are creating all these problems anyway. So just take money from them. I don't know if you have the same attitude, Walrus.
I do, pretty much, yeah. So I think, I mean, this is very interesting, but I think we have to push through. I have to be that guy, and because we have a lot of characters to talk about.
Okay, we'll try to be a little bit quicker. Peggy Hill.
Also, in the chat, be nice to Ashurwad. He doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. All right, I'll go. Peggy is next.
Yes, I mean, I wrote down the kind of like narcissistic white mother that we all know and love, right? But I mean, I feel like I know this character personally, or at least not as dysfunctional as she is, but you kind of like in the the sort of the archetype of the white woman, all of these characteristics that make her so dysfunctional, they exist. But they're all sort of accentuated in her, whether it would be like the sort of lack of self-insight, or the idea that she can be like, she's like much better at things than she thinks she is, so that she can sort of just start a business doing creating cookies or drawing postcards or something like that. I don't know. She's a great character for creating plots. I think she's the person in King of the Hill who creates the most problems, honestly. And it's much to Hank's credit and his kind of natural, timeless conservatism that he tries to maintain the relationship and tries to meet her halfway, even though meeting her halfway is like just total insanity in certain episodes in this show. How do you guys feel about this character?
I make the joke. Are we going to get demonetized? All right,
What's the joke?
is, so she's a woman. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think I don't want to like sit and have this be like this kind of MGTOW bash on women show. So we'll have to do a women appreciation stream.
Sure, yeah.
To make up for
women.
this, but
we love women here at the Longhouse.
You do, but there are certain
strong women who can work in the fields.
Certain traits that women have, right? That you can observe, and I think women of different races and different backgrounds have like different types of dysfunction.
Women
like
really do be like that. Yes.
But like with white women, I feel like Peggy Hill is just all of the like typical white woman dysfunctions she has, like every single one of them, and they are like hypercharged, like this kind of like slightly bipolar attitude that she has, some level of reality denial in terms of her ability, like this kind of like quasi-feminist things where she feels like she's always being overlooked in favor of men, even though it's not the case. Working part-time, like we can just keep going. What do you think, Jay?
So I like the character of Peggy Hill because and this is a broader, I guess, thing I like about this show is that she's obviously a ridiculous character, right? Like that she has these kind of like character faults and character foibles, but they're never
fair, as most characters beside Hank Hill are in the show.
Yeah, no,
I mean,
definitely.
just to
she's
clarify.
I don't know. There's kind of it's not. It never comes across to me, at least, as like mean spirited. Like it's kind of. It is a type of person that exists, and again, like I said, I'm going to say again, like I know dozens of people like her, and again, like it's just the show couldn't be made because, and I think about this in relation to a show like. And obviously, this is get your fedoras out. Like a
He
show like
would go like full on, Vax. He would have like 7 face shields and try to force Hank to wear it. I feel it.
oh really? I feel like she'd be like a Pizzagate type. But
Oh, really?
oh yeah, well
Oh, yeah,
maybe
maybe.
I know like
Ah,
Southern
yeah,
women, and it
yeah.
is very much like keep your hands off my kids. You like satanic lizard person.
Okay, yeah, I can see that angle too. Okay, never mind. Maybe you're right.
And maybe it's just me projecting again people I know, but I think that it both come from kind of like the core like negative
It's the
female
same
neurosis.
Puritan element.
Oh
right?
yeah, definitely. And
This
so-
could swing both ways, right? But it would either be keep your lizard hands off my son, or you should wear 7 face masks.
yeah,
there would
exactly.
be there would be nothing in between
There's
with this
nothing in
character.
between, yeah. Sorry, continue. If you had
No,
any
not at all. I mean,
more-
that's pretty much my piece on it. Is that
Okay.
it is a kind of an honest look at kind of like negative, female traits that you can't do in comedy anymore. Like if this were the modern show, she'd be the like, the unfulfilled, perfect woman who had to marry Hank, had to like marry down for Hank Hill. Whereas this one, there's a certain part where it's like, and then one of the other things is Hank and Peggy are kind of like equally yoked, and to a certain extent, they were kind of like high school sweethearts who made good. And that idea that like they are kind of like a real couple in the sense that they are, they're from the same background, they're from the same like social group, and that kind of like positive normalcy is not something you really see anymore, specifically in
yeah.
culture.
And the way she sort of takes her role as, wife, mother, homemaker, etc., seriously.
Right, exactly. And
At some point, she actually sort of like lectures Hank on it as well. I don't remember the context, but I do remember she's like, I do the cooking and I do the cleaning and I don't complain, but that has certain expectations of you or something.
Right. And like, okay, fair enough. Maybe it comes across as a little bit, unreasonable. But again, like, one, she's a woman, and two, that kind of like unspoken social contract, the idea that like
Yes,
there
yeah.
are different expectations for men and women, and both sides have a kind of an end of the bargain to hold up, I think is a message that is in this show and is very rare in like American culture, period, and specifically American culture made, I guess, like this late.
Yeah, every other show that you would consider quote unquote contemporary with King of the Hill would by this time have been sort of converted into progressive mouthpiece, right? Just look at The Simpsons.
Exactly, and like these two characters are both more conservative than I think the regular person would have been at, say, in the 1997 or in the early 2000s. Like they still have a lot of that Puritanism. I mean, their backstory is basically that it was sort of Peggy who took all of the initiative, right? She sort of proposed to Hank. I think he wants a wife, but he's a little bit, has a hard time with that, like dealing with the female elements, as you've seen, like these elements where these episodes where they start talking about, sex ed and like women having periods and that kind of stuff. Like he wants none of that stuff. He doesn't want to deal with anything that has to do with like female sexual health or like female sexuality, anything that has to do with that. He just wants kind of that's just like a woman's thing. He's just going to be over there doing his kind of manly good old boy shtick, and the woman's going to have to deal with all the woman stuff. So, and that's kind of what, a part of the where some of these problems come from is that he doesn't want to be involved in it, and Peggy kind of gets all the time to like to say influence Bobby, for instance, into a lot of stupid ideas and so on. I don't know if you have a similar impression of the dynamic between these two.
No, I definitely do. And this is, again, a very, I guess, like a very real thing that, and who knows how much of this is like, the ravages of modernity and how much of this is just what men and women are like. But I think that the same men like Hank Hill birthed the boomer culture of like, oh, I hate my wife. Like my wife is always nagging. But I think that was really born out of kind of like a type of male passivity, that to a certain extent isn't, like, it's just a human trait. I'm not going to say it's like specific to a generation, but that kind of like, oh, just leave me alone passivity.
Yeah.
It did birth a lot of kids like Bobby Hill, who just were hyper feminized despite the fact that they had an ostensibly masculine father, just because their father
had absent fathers, right?
Yeah, absent in effect, if not, physically.
I mean, their father was probably out doing stuff, and when he came home, he was too tired to care, and they were literally left to their mothers and the school system, who had then by that point become feminized enough to pretty much be the same.
And when the fathers figured it out, it was too late, right? I mean, another funny thing about Peggy, just jumping from one thing to another, is like the complex she has about her feet size, where she has what is it, like a size 47 or something in American shoes. It's just like this recurring gag where she's insecure about the size of her feet, which are genuinely large. This is also a thing like you couldn't do now, I think, with like a female character in like in anything really. It all has to be like perfect female characters who just have like the kind of complexes and insecurities because of society, right? It's nothing. It doesn't reflect
they have to
reality
figure out
in
how
any way,
to
right?
girl boss themselves out of it.
Exactly. Yeah, perfectly put. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot. We're getting to Luann and a lot of the Trailer Park Boys later.
Sure, we'll just move on.
Yeah. Do you want to comment a little bit on Cotton Hill and
oh yeah, his father,
his mother, yeah, the grandfather.
I mean, to me, I feel like they're more pure comedy characters. Like there's obviously there like, just like in any, there are kind of like elderly, kind of like horny old men in every culture. But to me, like and obviously maybe the kind of like old man obsessed with the glory days. But to me, that feels more like a stock character in comedy. It's less like a specifically interesting person to talk about.
I'd agree. The sort of the Korean War vet, or I think, is it Vietnam War vet?
Yeah, it would have been Vietnam from my perspective. But there are a lot of
horny grandpa and the hippie grandma is, it feels very stock. I'll agree with you on that.
And that is actually quite accurate, because it like, from the vision of Mike Judge, Hank Hill's grandfather, or Hank Hill's father, was actually supposed to be Tom Anderson from Beavis and Butthead. That's like this the character that he's based off, who has the exact same voice and plays a similar role in that show. But it's really Greg Daniels, who's like this other co-creator, who wanted to have like two of these characters that would be more of these comedic foils that Hank could bounce off, and one of them would be Cotton Hill and the other one was Luann Platter. So both of these exist more as comedic foils, but I think that there's a lot more to say about Luann Platter than about Cotton Hill. You get a lot of comedic leverage out of him, but like you said, he is more of just like this pure caricature, the very sort of nasty caricature person who doesn't necessarily accurately reflect anything.
Well, I will say something that's kind of funny is that I've talked before about the massive car collection I worked for, and the guy who's now passed away is actually he was quite a similar person to Cotton Hill, to the point that the scene where it is a flashback to him buying or trying to buy Hank a prostitute is something that my boss would offer and attempt to buy people prostitutes. And so that's something that, rewatching episodes for this, I was like, wait a minute, I've had that happen to me
I know that guy. Yeah.
That is an outlier. Like I've never met another person in my life who is like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do think there is in the old guard, people who were like that, but like with the Me Too culture and all this bullshit that the millennials and Zoomers have been put through, there's increasingly few of those people that are even allowed to exist in society anymore. I mean, of course, you have like Hank Hill's boss, Buck Strickland. We could get back to him later because he's not actually in the Hill family, but he is also that kind of type who would buy people prostitutes and has like this very extravagant, slightly degenerate personality.